Good morning. Time for another YouTube sermon as we continue our series on the book of Isaiah. Today we're looking at Isaiah chapter 10, verses 20 to 34. That's through to the end of the chapter. Reading from the NIV, and there's a subtitle in the NIV version, The Remnant of Israel. In that day, the remnant of Israel, the survivors of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, a remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. Though your people be like the sand by the sea, Israel, only a remnant will return. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous. The Lord Almighty, will carry out the destruction decreed upon the whole land. Therefore, this is what the Lord Almighty says. My people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians, who beat you with a rod and lift up a club against you as Egypt did. Very soon my anger against you will end, and my wrath will be directed to their destruction. The Lord Almighty will lash them with a whip, as when he struck down Midian at the rock of Oreb, and he will raise his staff over the waters as he did in Egypt. In that day their burdens will be lifted from your shoulders, their yoke from your neck. The yoke will be broken because you have grown so fat. They enter Aiath, they pass through Migron, they store supplies at Michmash. They go over the pass and say, we will camp tonight at Geba. Ramah trembles, Gibeah of Saul flees. Cry out, daughter Galim, listen, Laishah. Poor Anathoth. Madmenah is in flight, the people of Gebim take cover. This day they will halt at Nob, they will shake that fist at the mount of daughter Zion, at the hill of Jerusalem. See, the Lord Almighty will lop off the boughs with great power. The lofty trees will be felled, the tall ones will be brought low. He will cut down the forest thickets with an axe. Lebanon will fall before the mighty one. Amen. To anybody who just happens to be watching this who's a Hebrew specialist, I apologize for my pronunciation of all those words, but trying to do them whilst keeping a good cover face live for a recording isn't the easiest thing in the world. So before we begin, let's pray. And now may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our God and our Redeemer. Amen. Hope and fear. One thing I've noticed since recording sermons to YouTube is that I've changed my sermon style. Partly it's because I feel I have to be very stiff and formal on video. It's not easy to kind of ad-lib and interact with my congregations when I can't see them, when I'm not in the same room. Now, what I would normally do is start with a story of some kind, something that kind of sets a scene, sets the context, and realized that that might be appropriate today because it's not exactly a cheerful reading, and I thought something that would set the scene might help. So, I'm sure I'm not alone in not enjoying going to the dentist. Actually, that's not true. I'm afraid of going to the dentist. Partly it's that moment when the chair goes back and your feet are higher than your head, or that's how it feels, and all I can see is a bright light and a face mask. There's also the niggling worry that the dentist might find something wrong and I'm going to come out hours later with a numb face and missing half my teeth. Now, don't get me wrong, I appreciate that last bit is my own fault. If I went to the dentist more often, I could worry less about the prospect of pliers. Whenever I go to the dentist, though, albeit reluctantly, I do manage to shrug that fear off, more or less. All I need to do is remind myself that this is for my own good, that the dentist only wants the best for me. He or she is a professional who wants my oral health to be tip-top. I can even say that in retrospect about the young female dentist many years ago now, very wee lady. At one point in the proceedings, when she was trying to take a back tooth out, she had both knees on my chest, pulling as hard as she could whilst I was hyperventilating, trying to remove a particularly awkward and agonizing molar. Not the dentist's fault. Don't be afraid. Think about what's happening to you. That's the moral of that little story about a dentist. And it's the moral of our reading for today. Don't be afraid. Think about what is happening and why. Over the last few weeks in Isaiah, we've been introduced to the Assyrians as the instruments of God's judgment upon his people. Now, the Assyrians were a cruel bunch. They enjoyed mistreating captives and doing their best to altogether destroy the nations they conquered. That's what they did. They did that to the northern kingdom of Israel in the end. It would seem perfectly sensible to be afraid of such people, especially if, according to Isaiah, they were operating with a kind of divine sanction. However, Isaiah made it clear that things wouldn't be plain sailing for the Assyrians. In last week's reading, we saw that the Assyrians had, in some respect, overstepped the bounds of the divine sanction. They were greedy, proud, and destructive for the sake of greed and destruction and pride. And because of that, they too would be punished by God. This week, there's more of that divine punishment of the Assyrians. However, along with that is an unflinching proclamation of the devastation that the Assyrians would cause to God's people. Most powerfully of all in this reading is a sense of reassurance from God to his people. Somehow, despite all of this suffering and devastation, they shouldn't be afraid. The reason for that lies in God's character. There's a purpose behind all of that devastation and punishment, a purpose motivated by the character of God. And what Isaiah spells out is the righteousness of God. There's a hint of that right from the offing. In that day, and that might mean the aftermath of the Assyrian invasion of Judah, or sometime in the future, the people of God will have a change of heart. They'll no longer rely on their oppressors, but will instead rely on the living God. That harks back to King Ahaz's decision to ally with Assyria in the first place. But my point is, all of that suffering and punishment will bring about that change of heart. There is a purpose to it all. I've already said this reading is unflinching, and it's made clear that the way to this change of heart will be a terrible one. Only a remnant of the people will be left to return to the living God. There will therefore be widespread destruction and casualties. It's a work of God in the end, and the whole land will be consumed by it. Again, though, to say that this is a work of God is not just a threat. It's a reminder of who is in control of what happens to his people. The Assyrians are mighty, but God is infinitely more mighty. And where the Assyrians are self-motivated and prideful, God is infinitely righteous. So even this terrible affliction is motivated by, shaped by that righteousness of God. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous. That's the two sides to what is going to happen to God's people. It's overwhelming, but it's righteous, because in the end, it comes from God. That has to be spelled out, lest the people of God despaired at their helplessness before a cruel superpower like the Assyrians. They might have wondered whatever happened to the divine promise to Abraham, that his descendants would be so numerous that they would be uncountable. Was all of this, therefore, beyond God's control? No, all of this was under God's control. All of this reflected something of God's character. All of this was to make God's people more faithful and reliant upon him. So God told his people not to be afraid of the Assyrians, despite their cruelty, despite their destructiveness. Do not be afraid, because of who God is. Because of God, the Assyrians' reign of terror would come to an end. God's people might suffer under the Assyrians as painfully as they did under Egyptian slavery, but that slavery had come to an end thanks to God. Likewise, God had revealed his power and his love in the time of the judge Gideon by giving his people a victory in the face of overwhelming odds. Both of those episodes are referred to in the reading. The Assyrian yoke and burden would be broken, all thanks to God. The people had to keep that divine reassurance in mind, though, because the evidence might tempt them to think differently. Isaiah portrays the path of an invading, all-conquering army. Now, that's not the actual path that the Assyrians took to get to Jerusalem. It's simply there for its dramatic effect. How would the people feel as they learned reports of this all-conquering force getting closer and closer and closer to Jerusalem? Until finally, in this portrayal, these enemies are close enough to hurl defiance against the very walls of Jerusalem. How could anyone stop such an enemy? How could Jerusalem stand? Because of God. He alone could bring down even such an army, like a forester bringing down trees. This isn't an easy reading. No one wants to hear about widespread devastation and suffering and death. No one wants to contemplate the fact that this is divinely ordained. It's a comfortable fiction to think about God only in the good things in the world, to believe God is somehow only in control of those and not in the rest. Yet despite all of this, our reading for today is a message about reassurance and even hope, and why there is no place for despair. Despite any appearances to the contrary, God is sovereign, God still cares, God still loves. There's always a divine plan and a divine purpose to everything God does, and it doesn't matter whether you want to get technical about the doctrine of providence and say the things God does and the thing God allows. It's the same thing. This reading is an invitation to look beyond what we can see and what the odds and probabilities will tell us, and to see God's handiwork. It's easy to see that and to talk about that as a generality, though, but harder in specifics. I've always felt and believed and said that when somebody comes to me in my professional capacity as a minister or as their pastor, and they've said, I am suffering, someone I love is suffering, what does it mean? I've always felt it's glib, irrespective of whether it's true, simply to say there is a purpose, a divine purpose, and a plan behind all of this. It's especially true in a reading like this, which reminds us that even great suffering, widespread devastation, is governed by God. Just as one example, but it's one that's pressing on the minds of all of us, this pandemic has claimed many lives, and it's come at a great cost to lots of different things in the world, not least the world's economy and people's livelihoods. To simply state that even this pandemic is part of God's purposes or plan, well, that's crass, no matter how true it is. And it sounds cowardly to retreat to mystery and to point out that we have no way of knowing what the point of all of this is. Well, that's called comfort for somebody who's trying to understand, somebody who's just trying to get by. There is, however, a different way of looking at this reading, one that might seem counterintuitive. These terrible experiences of God's people had the ultimate intent of making them more faithful and reliant upon God. And that's the purpose for us of a reading like this, and to contemplate the things that are happening in the world. Even in the midst of their suffering, God intended for his people to have hope and to be reminded of his power and his love. While it's not retreating into mystery for me to say that we can't understand what the point and the purpose of something like this pandemic might be. But it can, however, be a catalyst for us to be more faithful and more reliant upon God, to have hope and to exercise our faith, to make faith in God the thing that gets us by. Now, when I say to have faith in God, I mean God himself, to allow God to be the one who gets us through. It's an opportunity to remind ourselves that nothing is beyond God's control and God's sovereign power, no matter what things look like. To not be afraid even when so much of what is happening is beyond our control or anybody's control. I'm not saying that that is the purpose of the pandemic, but it can be our purpose. To use this time to grow closer to God and find that the frustrations and the fears are not things that drag us down. They can be the things we find, to our surprise and our joy, that bring us closer to God. Amen.